Staying healthy in ministry is vitally important to fulfilling the God-given purpose for your life. In this video series, we're looking at 5 areas of our lives as leaders that we should be healthy in: spiritually, relationally, physically, mentally, emotionally, and financially. Get ready to hear an encouraging message from one of our speakers today.
Hello and welcome to the called video series, Healthy Pastors, where we will be discussing some various topics that we think will be helpful to you as pastors. My name is Don Headley, and I'm one of the Executive Vice Presidents here at AG Financial. AG Financial is the financial arm for the Assemblies of God and provides resources such as lending, insurance, investments, planned giving, retirement, not only the pastors within our fellowship, but many of the individuals that sit in the pew at many of our AG churches. Today we're going to be discussing savings, which we believe is very important to the financial health of our pastors. I remember early on in my career, I worked at a bank and we had a savings program for young children. We called it the Looney Tunes Savings Program. And these young children would show up with not a care in the world, no expenses, but bringing in bags of coin or little quarter savers that we're pretty sure that the parents or grandparents provided for them. So fast forward to these young kids growing up and becoming working adults, where now they have an income, but they also have expenses. And so now the joy of savings may have a little different look than when they were coming in as young children with no cares and no expenses to worry about. Some people tend to tie savings and tithing together when they think about when they will start doing that. For instance, I often hear people say, well, when I have a little more income, or maybe I get some of my bills paid off or my expenses paid off, then I'm going to start savings. So the issue is really not a matter of what your income is. The issue is more about what you do with the income you have. So a savings plan is not waiting to the end of the month and seeing what is left over after you've paid all your expenses, done everything you've wanted to do all month, and then whatever's left, it becomes your savings plan. You have to plan to save. Proverbs 21:5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty." So people who plan tend to have much more success than those who have no plan at all. I also like Proverbs 21:20 in the New Living Translation that says, "The wise have wealth and luxury, but the fools spend it all." That same verse in the Message states this: "Valuables are safe in a wise person's home, but the fool puts it out for a yard sale." You understand then why we say savings is so important. It has to be a major foundation or cornerstone of your foundation when you go through life, having a plan and sticking to that plan when it comes to savings. There's really not an exact science to savings. Everyone's got a different opinion of what works and what doesn't work. But today we want to just give you a few guidelines that maybe you can use as a starting point for your savings plan. We start with the 10-10-80 principle. 10% to tithing, 10% for savings, and 80% you live on the rest. Some people would say it this way: tithe and then live on less than you earn. So doing that, actually, it's a great way to start your savings program, but it may not necessarily hit some of the percentages that we talked about earlier. Another concept you might hear in the financial world is the 50-30-20 rule. What does that mean? Well, 50% goes to needs, 30% goes to wants, and 20% goes to savings. Now, you have to realize that in those buckets, that 50-30-20, you still need to find a place where the tithing comes out of that. So we don't want to miss that part of it. So the 20% savings in this rule is obviously a little higher than the 10% when I quoted the 10-10-80 principle. In this 20%, it's assumed that retirement will also be a part of that. The retirement piece is a very important piece for everyone, including you as pastors. And so we feel that is so important that one of our next video series will be dedicated just to retirement so that we can dig in a little deeper as to what that looks like and some of the ideas that we can present to you at that time. As I speak to you today, some of you that may be listening may be in their 20s or in their 30s, and you may think, well, that 10% savings works for me, and it might because of the fact that you've got some things working for you. One, you have time. Two, you have compound interest, which is everyone's friend when it comes to savings. And three, you've got the opportunity to change your plan as you go along. But maybe you're in your 50s or your 60s, and all of a sudden you're thinking, I've got a lot of catch up to do. So that's where you have to adjust that percentage of savings based upon where you are in your cycle of life. A 20 or 30-year-old may have a smaller percentage, but someone older may need to increase that percentage so that they can help get to a point of where they may be ready to retire or ready to do things in their future. When we talk about that 50% and 30%, the 50% needs, the 30% wants, I guess everyone has a different opinion about what truly are needs and what truly are wants. But just for clarification, I think it's safe to say that streaming services and Starbucks are probably more wants than they are needs. I think of myself that when it comes to the needs and wants, I enjoy hunting, and there's times where I think I need a new gun. And it's probably not a need as much as it is a want. So again, I think you all understand that when we look at the needs and wants in our life, we just have to be specific about what we need and what we actually want and make good decisions when it comes to that. I recently read an article that stated 63% of millennials would not have the ability to cover an unexpected cost of $500. That's amazing, that's surprising, but it's probably a true fact. So that brings us to the point of what we call an emergency fund. What happens in those situations? How do I, at a minimum, be prepared to handle those situations? So when we talk about savings, and we've talked about the percentages and what that looks like, let's start with the stepping stone of at least set up an emergency fund. At least have those funds set aside so that in the likelihood of an emergency, which is more than likely going to happen, how do we prepare for that? The rule of thumb is typically 3 to 6 months of your income should be set aside in what they call an emergency fund. So that if by chance you lose your job or an accident happens and your income stops, how do you handle those monthly bills until such time you're back on your feet or you're in a new job? For example, let's say your rent payment or your mortgage payment, your credit card payments, your student loan payment, maybe a car payment, your utilities, let's say they add up to $1,000. Well, let's do the quick math. If you have 3 to 6 months of that, then you need to have $3,000 to $6,000 in a savings account that you have titled, this is my emergency fund. So in the instance that an emergency happens, you can be prepared to handle that financially. Let me give you an example of what should not be a part of your emergency fund. Credit cards should not be an alternative to an emergency fund. Never use your retirement as part of your emergency fund. When you start retiring and you've set aside retirement dollars, you have to remind yourself, those are retirement dollars. Those are for the time when I finally can retire. The third point that I wanted to mention is when it comes to savings, there's typically 2 types of savings you want to think about. You have a short-term and a long-term. And you often hear me say buckets, and I may have already used that, but it's easy to kind of picture buckets when it comes to here's my short-term savings in this bucket, here's my long-term savings in this bucket. You never want to commingle them. You don't want to just pour them all in and say, here's all my savings, because I think it's important to be able to distinguish between the two. When we talk about short-term savings, we're referring to the emergency fund and then any other savings that you want to keep anywhere from 12 to 18 months term as far as how long you tie something like that up. Long-term savings would be something that is anywhere from 18 months going forward. So what you do is you determine how much you really need on a short-term basis, and you take a look at that, you put those in the buckets you feel like that's where you want them, and then whatever is remaining, put them out towards your long-term. Those could be long-term CDs or investment certificates, or maybe some of you, if you have the risk tolerance, you may want to get into the market. So those are some of the things you would use for long-term as opposed to short-term. So the danger of lumping both short-term and long-term together is you're not giving yourself the opportunity to grow some of your investments for future use. And if everything is just in that short-term bucket, you may be tempted to just pull out of that bucket more easily than if you know it's something that's long-term and you've set that aside and you know that's kind of like hands-off for now. So the fourth point I would want to encourage you with is, how do you know how you're doing with your savings plans and your savings goals? You've made the commitment to start savings, you've put a plan in place, and now the question is, how do you know how you're doing? So let me give you an example of something you can use to track your savings progress. You've often heard the term net worth, and I have to admit, in my younger days, I never knew exactly what net worth meant. So as I got older, I began to understand what the net worth was all about. And it's a very simple calculation, but can be used as a guideline, a benchmark to measure your progress. Let me explain how that works in a very simple format. So first of all, you take everything you own, which are called your assets, maybe your house or your car, your checking account, your savings account, anything like that you list as, here are my assets. And then you list all your liabilities, which are anything you owe. So for instance, if you have a car payment, you list the balance of your car loan. If you have credit card balances, you list that. If you have a mortgage, you list that balance. So you take your assets, everything you own, and you subtract the liabilities, everything you owe, and whatever's left is considered your net worth. So that's a very easy way of just tracking and seeing where you are with that. But it's a great way and a great exercise to do on a yearly basis to give yourself something to reach for, to have a goal. It gives you the opportunity to see what you've done that year and maybe set some goals for the future. But I would really encourage you to do that, get that template, use that, and then be able to look back maybe 5 years or 10 years and say, wow, look what I've done, look where I've come from. But it gives you also the desire to look where I want to go. Tracking your savings should be your primary goal. Let me emphasize just one more time. As you track your goals, make sure it's your goals and your goals alone, and don't let it become a comparison for anyone else and what their savings account looks like. My final point is this: start now. For some of you that I'm talking to, maybe you've already put a plan in place, and to you I say congratulations, but build on that. Don't be comfortable with where you're at, but look at how you can maybe step it up. Look for ways that maybe you can increase your savings, maybe a little bit at a time, but do something. And to those who have never started a savings plan because you said, I just can't afford to do it right now, let me say you can't afford not to do it right now. You need to start with a plan and let that plan start now. We've covered some ideas of how you can start your plan, but I can't emphasize enough to start. Do something. Maybe sit down with your spouse, or if you're on your own, just sit down and look at everything and say, what can I do? Where can I find a small percentage that I can start setting aside for savings? Because when you build that plan and when you take it and intentionally start, you'll be amazed of how that works for you. In concluding, I circle back to the small kids and remember how when they would come into the school and be so excited to do their savings. And for us as adults, we've probably lost the joy of savings because we have so many things that demand all of our money that savings is sometimes not as joyful as the kids would sometimes make it. But I would encourage you to find joy in savings, knowing that your savings today will make a difference for you and your family in the future. So I hope during this video, this becomes a personal video that in my mind, I feel like I'm talking directly to you. That we're having coffee and we're just sitting down and we're talking about some of the financial concerns of life. And one of those is savings. And so if during this video there's something I can say that might encourage you or help you, then that's my desire as we kind of walk through some different points. I know some of these points I've shared today and talking about percentages and net worth and emergency funds and short-term and long-term savings, some of this can definitely be overwhelming. And I don't want that to come across that way. But I want to encourage you that if you're at that starting point of saying, I've not done any of that, don't let that overwhelm you. Just stop and say, what is one thing that I can take away from this video? What is one thing that I can start doing right now? And you have to decide that. You pick and choose what makes the most sense for you. If it's a percentage, great. If it's saying I'm gonna save whatever I can have left over after I've spent wisely, then start there. But have a plan. Do something that you recognize I'm doing something that is going to move me forward in my savings plan.